this afternoon. I'm Reverend G. Sandall, a grateful alcoholic who, by the grace of God and the support of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, I have been able to maintain sobriety since January 1st, 1974. I'm honored today to serve on the board of Fellowship of Recovering Clergy and have been active with the conference since its inception. We've already had a great speaker, and we look forward to hearing our next speaker, Dr. Nicole Labor. It is my privilege to introduce her as she holds professional credentials all over the place. And her most important role, though, is as an addiction medicine physician, an accomplished author, and a person in recovery herself. Currently, Dr. Labor serves as the medical director at 180 Recovery in Worcester, Ohio. And anytime I say something that's not correct, just correct me. In addition to her directorship, she travels extensively to provide training and consultation on the topics of addiction, specifically focusing on the understanding of addiction as a brain disease. Her philosophy is addiction is a disease of impaired brain reward, motivation, and memory circuitry, not a moral failure. She teaches that addiction hijacks normal learning and reward pathways. Totally agree. The opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And we just heard that from our previous speaker. Recovery involves retraining the brain through structure, accountability, and community. Shame and moral judgment block healing, understanding, and compassion to restore it. In her book, Alcoholic Deconstructed, she provides a blunt, funny, and deeply personal look at how addiction works, written by both clinicians and people in recovery. I'd like to introduce Dr. Nicole Labor.
Hi. Hello. Yes, hello. Thank you for having me. I hope everybody's having a great day. So I'm going to share my screen, I think. And let's do this. Okay. So hopefully that's working. Everybody can see that.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So hi. Yes, thank you for that introduction. That was lovely. I am a board certified family medicine physician, board certified addiction medicine physician, and a person in long-term recovery. So yes, all of that stuff is true. And I run a bunch of treatment facilities here in Northeast Ohio and technically all over Ohio because I'm currently the interim medical director for Ohio Guidestone, which has offices all over Ohio. Let's see. Okay, so let's get right into it. Why do I do this? Why am I talking about this? When I first started my career in addiction medicine, I worked for Summa Health here in Ohio, which is actually at the hospital where the first alcoholics were ever treated by Dr. Bob and Sister Ignatia. So I was running the detox center in the ground zero place for Alcoholics Anonymous. And I would be asked by the hospital to give lectures to other healthcare providers about things like, oh, can you talk to us about stimulants? Can you talk to us about specific drugs or whatever. And I would do a lecture, and at the end, I would get all these questions from people that was really indicative of the fact that nobody understood the disease process. Nobody even understood what addiction was at its core. And so I created the Addiction 101 lecture, which for all intents and purposes has gone viral. The problem is that we can call it a disease all day long and people can buy into this disease concept, but we don't treat it the same. And so when someone with, say, diabetes decides to eat a piece of cake, knowing without taking insulin, knowing that that they could have a seizure and die, and gets behind the wheel of a car and causes an accident and they die, or hurt somebody else, ultimately nobody's talking about how their kids are better off without them because they made this terrible choice. But when someone with addiction does the same, there's a lot of people that have opinions about how, oh, the world's better off without them, or they're some kind of scumbag because they made this choice to get behind the wheel of a car. And so that to me says, like, okay, people really don't get it. They really don't understand what's happening. So addiction is a brain dysfunction. We see it most readily with chemical use, but certainly there are a lot of behavioral aspects of it, and there are certainly a lot of addiction-like uh, things happening in society. But drugs are just the symptom of addiction. So the underlying problem is brain disease, and essentially the drug is the symptom. And what we do is we fixate on the specific drug instead of fixating on the disease. And we say, oh, everybody's using this drug. Let's have task forces and let's create new laws and legislation around this specific drug. And then we're just bopping that mole down and the next one pops up. And we're not focusing on how do we unplug the game altogether. And we've seen this over and over and over. 1800s, we were prescribing morphine to everybody for everything because opiates are great drugs. They relieve pain and anxiety and they help you tolerate intolerable people and they make you motivated to do things. And so they were prescribing them to everybody, mostly women, in the 1800s because they had opinions and we didn't like it when women had opinions in the 1800s. So we medicated them. And then the morphine caused problems. So then in the 19th, so they stopped it. The 1900s, Bayer Pharmaceutical created prescription heroin. That was the Industrial Revolution. People were working 80-hour work days. It was like produce, produce, produce. And here's this medication that's going to help you do that with, help your pain and your anxiety and like to be able to do more. And of course, it was great until it wasn't anymore. And then we saw a rise of illicit heroin use in the 60s and 70s. We saw the rise of crack cocaine in the early 80s. We saw methamphetamine. People were blowing themselves up in early 2000s in their backyard shed meth labs. And we solved the problem of the methamphetamine crisis by what? You have to use your driver's license to buy cough medicine now. That was our solution to that. And then we saw bath salts. That was like a big, a zombie apocalypse. I mean, people were acting crazy. And then the opiate epidemic, of course, the most recent opiate epidemic, which we fixated on to the point of creating new laws and making it difficult for doctors to actually treat real pain. And then we started putting everyone on medication, and then now we're seeing meth again. Meth and legal marijuana with super high potency, right? Both of which are causing psychosis. So we just keep doing the same thing. In the early, and then behaviorally, we see it, more globally, I would say, because substance use we're going to see in a kind of a small subsect of the population, but I think the behavioral addictions we see kind of much larger and milder. So in the early 2000s, the internet and gaming on the internet came out, and that started to cause problems. In 2010, smartphone and social media happened, and we all know like everybody likes on Facebook. And then in 2018, when they legalized online gambling, in the first month of being legal, we had an increase of self-reporting phone calls of 270%, 17%. So in 1 month, 217% increase in people calling and saying, I have a problem in 1 month. And this makes sense because when you look at availability and novelty and the targeted advertising for these sorts of things, we would expect to see sort of this trend. So the question is, in medicine, how does something qualify as a disease? In order to be a disease, you have to have an organ or an organ system, you need a defect in that system, and then you need symptoms because of it. So if we're talking about something like diabetes, let's say type 1 diabetes, the organ is the pancreas, the defect is that you have a decrease in beta islet cells, so you can't produce insulin, and then the symptoms are high blood sugar, but then eye disease, kidney disease, neuropathy, etc. So the question becomes, how do we fit addiction into the same exact model as we can fit other diseases? And I can put any disease in here, chronic or acute. I can put a broken bone in here. I could put cancer in here. I could put heart disease. Any disease fits this model. Well, with addiction, we're dealing with a pretty huge disadvantage, and that is the fact that it is a brain disease, and we do not understand the brain very well. I think we only know like 25% of its capability at this point. But if we're going to take a reductionist standpoint, which I don't love doing personally, but professionally, I'll do it. So if we reduce everything, our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, our physical movement, everything can be reduced down to electrical and chemical signals in the brain. The brain has to be firing for any of those things to be happening. So simple, just life-sustaining things like breathing, blinking, heart beating. Obviously, there's electrical activity in the brain causing that to happen. Physical movement, whether it's conscious or unconscious. You shift in your seat because you're uncomfortable, you don't even realize you're doing it, but you can watch people even on Zoom, you can see people move electrical and chemical signals in the brain. Emotions. You've seen the commercials on late night TV about the medications for the people that like, do you cry suddenly, inappropriately? Are you laughing when you should be crying or whatever, right? That's a pseudobulbar. That's a brain disease, right? There's a brain disease. There's a something wrong that makes you emotionally respond incorrectly, and you can't do anything about it. Like you can't just make yourself not do that. When we look at brain tumors, different brain tumors in different locations of the brain, they affect somebody very, very differently depending on where they are. So the symptom of the brain dysfunction can be behavioral, it can be emotional, it can be mental, it can be physical, it can be just in thought, it can be personality change. So it can be mood, it can be a lot of different things. But as the people outside of the person's brain, we only see the after effect. We only see the behavior or the way that they respond to the world. The two parts of the brain that I talk about most commonly would be the midbrain, right? And I'm dealing specifically with the limbic system, the mesolimbic system, the nucleus accumbens, and the tegmental area, but that's irrelevant. You don't need to know any of that. But the midbrain and the frontal cortex. Okay, these are the two areas of the brain that I think are the most important to understand if you interact with people who have addiction. So the midbrain is this very primitive, old part of our brains where our emotions are found. And it is not conscious. You have no control over it. It is our life or death processing station. So if you're being chased by a bear or a tiger, and you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna die. I have to think, how do I get out of this? Your midbrain is what actually activates. And it starts to go through the files in your brain to look for a solution. And when it finds one, it's like, go, do this right now. The frontal cortex, which is, where our logic and goal planning and all of that, that's shut down during times when our brain thinks we need to survive. So the primary functions of the midbrain are to make sure we have food, nutrients, and water. So it drives us to seek those. To kill off or run away from predators. So it drives us to obviously try and survive a threat, and then to procreate for perpetuation of the species. The frontal cortex, though, now that's the part of the brain that makes you you. That's the part of the brain that makes humans human. It's where our personalities are, it's where our skill sets are, it's where love, morality, ethics, values, willpower, right? All of the things that we associate with like humanness are wired through the frontal cortex. But that means all of our skills are wired through the frontal cortex. And what that looks like for people is like like a highway, like a super highway. And every time we engage in a skill, we practice a skill, we build a wider and wider highway through the frontal cortex. So if my goal is to become a musician, a guitar player, I can make the decision to become a musician, but if I take no action, I'll never become a musician. If I take action, I pick up the guitar and I practice it, I build a little footpath through my frontal cortex. And then each time I pick up that guitar and play, I build a wider and wider road. And eventually, I have a 16-lane highway with traffic in both directions, and I'm ready to play at Carnegie Hall because my skill set is so good, right? So that highway from I want to be a musician, to B, I'm playing in a substantial way, that is the most efficient highway that I have for music. So now I decide, hey, I want to play the piano. I have to build a slightly different road. Okay. So the point is skill sets are run through the frontal cortex. Drugs and alcohol, which are the same, are they're highly rewarding substances. Okay. And I'm going to explain why that matters, but they're all the same. Drugs and alcohol, anything that can be addictive is the same to the brain. And they work in the midbrain. They do work in the cortex, and I'll talk about how, but where the defect is in that disease model is in the reward center, the midbrain. And we know this because for many years we thought addiction was a moral failing. We thought people with addiction were bad people that made bad choices. But we find that when you take a mouse and you insert the probe into its brain and you get it into the midbrain, the reward center, and you allow that mouse to hit a lever and self-stimulate the reward center, the mouse will hit the lever over and over and over until it dies. Like it won't eat or drink or participate in any mouse-like activities in order to just continue to get that stimulation. And mice don't have morals or ethics or values, and they're not from bad homes or anything. So essentially, we know that repeated use of highly rewarding substances for the select piece of the population that gets addicted is essentially a rewiring of the brain. So the reward center starts to believe erroneously that highly rewarding substances or stimulation of the reward center in super high amounts is akin to eating nutrients or killing predators or running away. So becomes part of the survival mechanism of the reward center. And for people who have never had an addiction, I always use this example, honestly, because I haven't found a better one. But if you are on day 5 without water, you're in the desert, you haven't had water in 5 days, your organs and organ systems are shutting down, you are not going to survive another 24 hours without water. And I come up to you and I hand you a bottle of water and I say, if you drink this, I'm going to take your kids and your house and your bank account. There is not a person on earth who's biologically capable of refusing my water. In that moment, your frontal cortex, which is where your bonding and love and values and where you value your family and your kids and all the stuff, that's shut down. That is not working in a moment where you're like literally going to die. The only thing working is your midbrain, and your midbrain is screaming at you. The only thing we need is water. That's it. Water. Don't, it's not even water. It's like tunnel vision. So you take the water and you drink it and you satiate that midbrain, and that midbrain kind of quiets down and goes, oh, okay, we're going to be okay for a little while longer. Then your frontal cortex turns back on and you're flooded with kind of guilt and shame. Like, oh my God, I just gave up all these things I value just for a bottle of water. And most likely you'll try and talk me into giving you your stuff back until the thirst kicks back in. And then ultimately you would sacrifice it all again for a bottle of water. In addiction, instead of water, the brain is creating high levels of dopamine. So you can see, all right, so this is a this concept, I call it the labor 80-20, and just I'm not making up the actual statistics, but I sort of streamlined it to make it a little more understandable. So essentially, here's what I know. Of the entire population, and let's just stay in the US for right now. I'm not talking about globally, but in the US, let's say 80% of all people in the US use drugs and alcohol to some degree, maybe just once, maybe twice, maybe a couple times a month, but 80% use drugs and alcohol. Have made the choice, I should say. 80% have made the choice to have at least one drink in their life or one use of marijuana or something. Of that 80%, 20% develop a problem. Okay, so we're talking about maybe 20% of the entire population develops a problem with substances. So that could mean legal problems. They maybe get OVIs. It could mean medical problems or whatever. But of that 20%, so of that smaller subset, 80% of them don't develop the disease of addiction. They just have problematic substance use, which means that when they make the decision to just stop, they are able to just stop. Whereas that 20% that's left over truly develop addiction, they cannot just stop. And the problem is that 80% of problematic users are the ones going, I just used meth for 20 years and I put it down and walked away. And all you need to do is have willpower and be strong. And, that's it. And the whole rest of the world's looking at them going, yeah, they did it. Why can't you do it? And that little 20% is going, what's wrong with me? They did it. Why can't I do it? And those are the people that have the brain changes that I talk about. Okay. So I could call it true addiction or whatever, but essentially there is a difference and you can see the difference on brain scans. I can take two people who have used meth for 10 years every day, put them in a brain scan, show them a picture of their drug of choice, and their brains will light up differently based on whether or not they have the changes of the brain that indicate addiction versus the changes in the brain that indicate just problematic use. Now, the next day, the person with problematic use's brain can flip over to addiction because of one more use, et cetera. Genetically, it gets triggered. But what I'm saying is that not everyone that uses drugs has addiction. And we throw the term around like it's, and we just overuse the term to be honest. We just overuse it for everything. But even within the world of people that use drugs, people say, I was addicted to cocaine and I used it all through my 20s. Okay, then what happened? Well, time to grow up. I had to get a job. Well, then you weren't addicted. That's not addiction. Okay. So here's how our brains work, super simplified times like a billion. All right. We all have neurotransmitters in our brain, trillions of them, trillions of brain cells. And our brain cells are little factories, and they are producing neurotransmitters, which are chemicals in our brain that communicate with each other. So you are creating all of these neurotransmitters like dopamine and glutamate and GABA and serotonin and norepinephrine, right? Some people have heard of some of these. And we're storing them in vesicles inside of the brain cells. And when that brain cell gets stimulated, either electrically or chemically, it releases a bunch of neurotransmitter. And then that neurotransmitter floats around and it finds its receptor on an adjacent cell and it binds there and it triggers that cell to then release neurotransmitter. And the process goes on until it reaches an end point neuron, an end point brain cell that then sends the signal to have the end result. So if I'm walking down the street and I see a crack or a hole in the ground, I receive electrical stimulation through my eyeballs because I see the crack. And that stimulates the brain cell. And the brain cell releases a bunch of neurotransmitters and that floats around and then binds to the next cell and so forth and so on until eventually a brain cell in my parietal area where my legs and arms and body parts are connected. One of those brain cells gets stimulated and it sends a signal down to my leg that says, take a step. Okay. So I would step over the hole or the crack. So the point is, and again, simplified times a bajillion because 400 million brain cells are involved in just blinking your eye. So but the idea is it doesn't really matter what the originating signal was, right? What matters is what the outcome is. Like, what do I do? Because if there's a breakdown somewhere in that connection, in that communication system, I can receive the information that there's a hole in the ground. But if there's a breakdown somewhere in that communication, I may just sit down or I might step in and fall in the hole. Like, I may have the incorrect response depending on where the damage is or the defect is in that communication system. So the original signal doesn't matter. The outcome is what matters. So the problem we run into is that if we are using a substance that's highly rewarding, the reason it's highly rewarding is because it releases dopamine into the reward center. Well, then all drugs that release dopamine into the reward center are going to be interpreted the same way. If I use cocaine, it's going to bind to a nerve cell. where there's a cocaine receptor, and it's going to release a bunch of different neurotransmitters. And some of those neurotransmitters are going to go to my brainstem, and they're going to say increase blood pressure, increase heart rate. Some of the neurotransmitters are going to go to the pain centers because cocaine does help relieve pain to some degree. Some of the neurotransmitters are going to go to my frontal cortex, and they're going to say, well, I feel really good about this. I am, I have a lot of energy. I am a good dancer. I want to have sex with everybody. This is awesome, right? That may be my experience consciously with cocaine. Or some people will go, I do not like this. I'm anxious. I'm nervous. I'm shaky. I hate this feeling. I feel speedy and it's gross and my heart rate and I don't, right? Your conscious experience with cocaine can be different. However, cocaine also stimulates the release of dopamine into the reward center, which remember is subconscious. So subconsciously, your brain is going, I really like cocaine. It gives me a lot of dopamine. I like it. It's great. Doesn't matter what your conscious experience was. Doesn't matter that consciously you didn't like it. Subconsciously, your brain loves cocaine. So same is true for alcohol or opiates. No matter what drug I plug in there, it binds to a receptor, releases neurotransmitters that go all over the place. Some go to the frontal cortex. That's your conscious experience on that drug, but they all release a ton of dopamine into the reward center. And the dopamine is the same because it's made by our brain cells. So our brain cells are dumping the same exact dopamine, whether I've used cocaine or opiates or THC or alcohol. It's the same dopamine. And the subconscious part of our brain that's getting it, the pleasure center, doesn't know the difference. It doesn't care. It's not going, oh, I know we got 600 molecules of dopamine from cocaine, but remember how anxious it made us? We should probably not get that. That's not how it works. The reward center goes, we got a lot of dopamine. We want that again. Okay. So this is where I run into a lot of problems in the treatment world and with helping people understand, like, once you're addicted to one substance, once you truly have issues with one substance, all highly rewarding substances are going to be problematic, whether you want to believe they will or not. And the reason, or part of the reason, is pleasure. So pleasure is a perceptual construct of the human brain, and it is required for survival. So pleasure is not this luxury. It's not like this joy that where it is actual necessity. So we need to eat nutrients. We need to bond with people. We need to reproduce. These are wired through our reward center as pleasurable experiences so that we will continue to do them in order to survive. One of the first things we do when a baby is born is we feed it, and we feed it because we need it to eat so that it will continue to crave food. So if we don't have pleasure from things, we don't thrive. Our survival ability declines. And so pleasure is our brain signal to like keep going to get this pleasurable thing. Addiction hijacks this. Addiction is what rewires. This is the defect part of the whole disease process. So dopamine is our pleasure chemical. Dopamine is the drug that drives us to seek pleasure. Okay. Dopamine is the one that's like, we enjoyed that. Let's go get it again. It just keeps pushing us towards the pleasurable, salient experience. But we have a set point for pleasure. Okay. Meaning that every time dopamine gets dumped into our reward center, we don't necessarily feel joy and pleasure, right? There are some things that universally give us pleasure, like falling in love or having a baby or getting a raise at work or being acknowledged in some way, right? That gives us some pleasure. We get some dopamine, and most everybody will get enough dopamine from that experience to cross the threshold. But then we have individual things that give us pleasure. If you are someone that likes crafting, or you like music, or you like jogging or whatever, it's because those activities release enough dopamine in your reward center to make it to cross your threshold, to make it pleasurable for you. But not everyone necessarily likes jogging. So think of it this way. Your reward center is a baseball field, okay? And your dopamine receptors are hanging out in this field. And let's say, for the sake of simplicity, you have 100 players on your field. So you've got 100 dopamine receptors on your field, and they're all spread out, standing there with their mitts up. And every time something good happens, some dopamine gets dumped into the field, the baseballs. They get dumped into the field, stays for a short period of time, and gets sucked back out. In order for your brain to register that as a pleasurable experience, 10 players have to catch a ball, at least 10. So those experiences that I was talking about, things like falling in love or getting acknowledged or getting a raise or something, you're dumping 20 balls in the field. But because it's saturated with players, chances are at least 10 will catch balls, right? You pick up the guitar, you play with your grandkid or whatever, you're going to dump 25 balls in the field. You fall in love, maybe 50 balls in the field, right? So 10 players are catching the balls. Your brain's going, yes, I like this. This is good. We can keep doing this. When we use highly rewarding substances, the reason that I call them highly rewarding substances is because we're dumping like 250 balls in the field. Okay. So every player is probably catching a ball and the brain's going, oh, whoa, mind blown. This is awesome. Okay. And so the reward center then starts to get inundated with balls because now we're using the substance more and more and more. So it's just dumping balls into the field over and over and over. The brain is very efficient, like a very efficient team manager or owner or whatever. So the manager is going to come in and go, hold on. We are getting inundated with all this dopamine, with all these baseballs. I do not need all these players on the field. I'm not paying all these salaries anymore. Let's go. And he starts benching players. So the brain starts down-regulating or pulling dopamine receptors out of the reward center. And as that happens, we get down to only 10 ball players left in the field. So if there's only 10 ball players left in the field, they're scattered. They're few and far between, which means that when I dump 15 balls into the field when I'm playing the guitar, which was usually enough to give me pleasure, chances are those 10 players are not going to get to those balls that got dumped in time to register as a pleasurable activity. So things that used to be enjoyable are literally biologically not anymore because you're not getting enough dopamine to saturate the few receptors that you have left. However, if you dump 250 or 300 balls into that field, those 10 players will catch a ball, which means the only thing that gives that brain any pleasure anymore is highly rewarding substances because there's no natural way to dump 250 balls into that field, only chemicals or certain behaviors genetically. So over time, the threshold for pleasure moves. So the fewer dopamine receptors you have, the more dopamine you need just to feel the same or just to feel good, normal pleasure. Which is why anybody that knows anybody who's ever been addicted, they used to love to do something. When they're in active addiction, we go, oh, she used to do this all the time. And now they're just at the bar all the time, or now they're just hanging out with their using friends all the time, right? It's because literally biologically they get no more pleasure from that. And we as humans do not do things that don't give us pleasure. And I put this in here because it comes up at the end of every lecture, and I need people to understand this. Alcohol and now THC, at least in some states, are the legals. Legality has nothing to do with whether or not the brain recognizes it as rewarding or not. Okay. Alcohol and THC are extremely rewarding. They dump 200 plus balls into that field. So the fact that they're natural, right? THC is a plant and alcohol is basically fermented sugar, so they're natural. But so is heroin comes from poppies and cocaine is a plant. So I'm not sure being natural and being legal have nothing to do with how the brain interprets it. Okay. And so we are seeing lots of problems. Well, alcohol is the number one killer. I mean, alcohol kills more people than any of the other drugs. And it always has. But we're seeing a lot of problems with THC now because obviously the potency has gone up in the last 20 years to the point where we're seeing permanent psychosis in young people from it. So we still see about a 9 to 12% addiction rate to THC, and alcohol is still around 15% addiction rate. The problem with this is, let's say I was dumping 250 balls into my ball field from using fentanyl or heroin. And so I'm dumping all of these balls into my field with heroin, and then you take away my opiates. You say you can't use opiates anymore. We're not using opiates anymore. Well, so then my players start to come back into the field And there's a period of time where I don't feel any joy from anything, right? Because I'm still waiting for enough players to come back that normal things make me feel good. But then I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to smoke some pot, or I'm just going to drink occasionally. Well, now what I've done is I've dumped another 200 balls in the field, which means the manager's like, oh, hold up. Don't put any more players back on the field. Just stay there. And so now the only way to feel better is to continue to use at least those substances. And so then if I need to use alcohol or marijuana to deal with a stressful Tuesday, my brain is going to need something stronger to deal with the death of a loved one or a loss of a job or something more catastrophic, right? Because I've essentially continued to use these substances as my only source of pleasure. So that's why it's problematic. And I include those two specific substances. I could also include in here kratom, which is the free over the counter, like feel free, or it's an over the counter medication, 7-OH, people call it. It could be in a plant, it could be a tea, it could be a drink. It's basically opiates. People need to go through detox to get off of it. It's highly addictive, but it is legal. It's over the counter. You can buy it at the gas station. It's really making my life difficult. Okay, so anyway, how do we remember or learn what gives us pleasure, right? Because if the dopamine set gets dumped during a pleasurable activity, how do we remember that? The answer is glutamate. So glutamate is another neurotransmitter that we have, and it basically makes like post-it notes and posts them all over our brain on things that like, hey, remember this gave us dopamine. This is awesome. And it's a very smart, if it can be smart. It's a very smart chemical. And so it recognizes the connection between dopamine and certain events, people, places, things, right? So the first time someone uses an oxycodone pill, whether it's prescribed for pain or just on the street, the brain, the reward center goes, oh my, 250 balls. That's awesome. We like this. So glutamate writes it down. Oxycodone is awesome, and puts a little post-it note in the brain. Then the next time you get an oxycodone, the brain goes, okay, yeah, we like this. Glutamate goes, hold on, that oxycodone came in an orange bottle. Orange bottles are awesome. Pharmacies are awesome. The guy with the blue hat on the house and first on the corner of first and third, he's awesome. The spoons are awesome. Tire gauges are awesome. Needles are awesome, right? All of the things that start to surround the blast of dopamine start to be connected to it through glutamate. It's like a sticky glue that connects them all together. And this is why people who have a history of opiate addiction, for example, they're going through opiate withdrawal. Say they've gone 2 days without any opiates. They're very sick, sweating, pale, like vomiting, dry heaving, like maybe even, pooping, shaking, chills. They feel awful. And they're sitting in their car waiting for their dealer, their drug dealer to come, and they see the dealer come around the corner and they instantly feel 10 to 20% better. They're going through a physical withdrawal, right? That's a physical experience. There's dependence on opiates that makes everyone go through physical withdrawal. But just seeing the potential relief associated with that guy starts the brain dumping dopamine into the reward center so that they are able to overcome some of the symptoms that they're having. So it's a very powerful connection between glutamate and dopamine. So there is a lot of research being done around trauma and addiction, and that is because primarily trauma looks exactly like addiction in the brain. They look very, very similar. Okay. When we experience chronic and severe stress, aka trauma, our brain responds by taking away dopamine receptors. It does this through a process where you have chronic and severe stress, you release corticotropin releasing factor, which is a hormone that prompts the downregulation of dopamine receptors. But all told, basically what happens is if you have chronic and severe stress, you have no ball players on your field. That's what happens. It's a evolutionary response to high levels of chronic and severe stress. So if you have no dopamine receptors to begin with, then your threshold for pleasure is already high. And this makes sense when we think about practically, like a practical example, say a child who's gone through some substantial trauma. And we don't get to determine what trauma is to somebody, right? It doesn't always have to be something real catastrophic. It doesn't have to be physical and sexual abuse or anything like that. Sometimes the brain interprets trauma as anything that's chronically stressful. If you were a latchkey kid in the 80s and you had to let yourself in every day and make yourself a snack and watch TV before your parents got home from work, your brain could have interpreted that as neglect, even though you weren't neglected. The brain can register whatever it wants as trauma and stressful. Like that is your stress response. So let's say some child goes through some sort of trauma in childhood, and now they're going through, adolescence, and they look depressed and dysthymic, and we're maybe getting them into psychiatrists here and there that are trying to throw serotonin at them and trying to, make them feel better because they're sad. And we're going, well, it's understandable considering the trauma in their life. Yeah, they're depressed, but really it's they have no dopamine receptors. So normal things that give people pleasure, they can't experience normal joy from. So they look very depressed. But the first time someone gives them a beer or a joint, they get 200 balls in that field. And they go, oh, this is what it feels like to be normal. Okay, let's do that. And then they continue to seek that. So they'll continue to seek that source of feeling normal. And as time goes on and they become more tolerant to the dose of what they're using, they'll need more and more because their receptors will continue to downregulate. And as they need more and more, they start behaving in a way that counteracts their value system, right? So when we do so, because people know right from wrong, most sociopaths can't be addiction addicts. That's because if you don't know the difference between right and wrong, this is a different process. But most people know right from wrong. So you've got these kids that are now using substances to feel normal, but now they have to start doing things to get these substances that violate their core values. So they know it's wrong to lie, cheat, and steal, but that's the only way for them to get the substances. So now they're lying, cheating, and stealing. What does that do? It makes them feel shameful. They become ashamed because they're violating their core values. And what is shame? Trauma, self-induced trauma. And so now they have started the same process that the original trauma did, which is to further exacerbate the downregulation of dopamine receptors. So now every time they do something to get drugs and alcohol, they feel guilty and shameful about it, which self-traumatizes, which makes things worse. However, they've also trained their brain through the cortex, which I'm going to get to believe that substances are the solution for feeling guilt and shame. So now they have to violate their core values again to get more drugs and alcohol in order to self-soothe, which then leads to more guilt and shame. And it becomes this negative feedback loop. And that can have, even if there was no trauma to begin with, if you just started using drugs and alcohol because it felt good to use drugs and alcohol, you were in college, you were partying with your friends, you had the genetic predisposition for it, you felt really good when you used drugs and alcohol, then you became addicted essentially, you downregulated dopamine receptors, and then you started violating your core values in order to get more and more and so forth. So the process doesn't matter chicken or egg, doesn't matter whether you were traumatized first or used addiction first, they're both the same. So basically, addiction is a pleasure deafness. It's an inability to experience joy and pleasure the way that you used to or the way that normal people do. So ultimately, in order for this process to happen, you have to have a gene for addiction. So you have to have a genetic predisposition for this to happen. 60% of all people have at least one gene for addiction. Most people have more than one. Obviously, if you can see it clearly in your family somewhere, grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, distant cousins on your father's side, if any of them had a problem with drugs and alcohol, congratulations, you have at least one gene. If you can't see it in your family, it's possible that it goes back 11 or 12 generations, or you could have had a mutated gene, meaning something somewhere along the way messed with your DNA, and you now have a gene that's been mutated to make you vulnerable to addiction. So you have to have the gene, and then you have to trigger the gene. And genes are triggered by different things. They're triggered by use, chemical use for some people, by environmental issues, stress and trauma, certainly. And so essentially, once the gene is triggered, though, this is a problem for everybody, for all time. Okay. So the example I use all the time, let's say I got somebody named Joe, Joe has a gene for addiction, but it's only triggered by opiates. His gene is going to be triggered by an opiate use and maybe 100 or 50 uses of an opiate. Okay. So Joe has to use an opiate 50 times in order for his addiction gene to turn on. And again, I'm simplifying a lot here. Um, Now, let's say Joe drinks alcohol every day, problematically for years. 10 years, Joe drinks alcohol every day. He gets some DUIs. His family can't stand being around him when he's drunk. He loses some friends. He drops out of college. Like, life is not great from his drinking, but he continues to drink because he likes it. One day, Joe says, I'm done. I'm done drinking. Time to grow up. I need to start being responsible. And he stops drinking. And he's very vocal about how, oh, see, I drank every day for 10 years. I put it down. I walked away. You know, you just need to be strong. You need to grow up. You need willpower. So Joe gets a job and he moves on and he gets married and he has kids and he's voted to the city council and he's an upstanding member of society and everybody loves Joe. He's a good guy. Never picks up a drink again. But Joe takes his family on a skiing trip. Joe ruptures his ACL. Joe needs surgery. He gets surgery on his ACL and he gets prescribed opiates. And he's taking the opiates. And for the first day or two, the amount of pain he has and the amount of opiate he gets kind of equal each other. So it's really just canceling out the pain. But after 2 days, the inflammation from the surgery is gone, but the amount of opiate he's getting is still the same, but the pain is less. So that little bit of gap in between the pain and the amount is euphoria. So he starts to realize, oh, you know what? This helps me deal with my anxiety. This is helping me sleep. This is making me motivated to do blah, blah, blah. And he starts to recognize benefits other than just pain relief. So maybe he takes a few more extra here and there and he calls the surgeon, hey, I need more. The surgeon says, Joe, you're an upstanding member of society. No problem. I'll send you more in. Now, 2 weeks later, Joe's calling for more, and the surgeon's like, oh, hold on there, Joe. This is way too early for me to fill this. I think there's a problem. I'm not doing it. So now Joe goes and starts stealing from his friends' medicine cabinets. He starts damaging relationships, blah, blah, blah. We all know the story. Joe winds up on the streets using fentanyl. He lands in my detox unit, and I say, Joe, my recommendation when you get out of here for the best possible chance of long-term sobriety is that you stay off of all substances that are highly rewarding because your dopamine receptors have now been messed with. And anytime you dump a large amount into your brain, you're going to start pulling receptors away. And he says, Dr. Labor, you're definitely the coolest doctor I've ever met, but you don't know me. You don't know me. And I drank alcohol every day for 10 years, and alcohol is not my problem. And I say, well, that's great. If it's not a problem, it shouldn't be a problem not to use it. However, my recommendation is you don't use it. Well, 2 weeks later or 6 months later, Joe is back on detox, and I'm detoxing him off of opiates, alcohol, and probably meth. Okay. Because once the receptors were triggered to start downregulating, which happened with his opiate use, now every substance is going to be a problem, including alcohol, which was not previously a problem for him. So if what I'm saying makes sense, right? If all of these things are true, then the reason that humans relapse should make sense. First and foremost is dopamine exposure. So the continued use of another substance that releases high level dopamine. So my drug of choice is heroin. I'm using it. I go home. I continue to smoke pot because it seems like a lesser evil, but I'm keeping those dopamine receptors from being able to come back. And so ultimately, I'm going to wind up relapsing on my drug of choice eventually. Or let's say I'm completely abstinent and I'm staying off of all drugs, and then I go into the ER with a sprained ankle and they give me Dilaudid. Or I go into the ER with a panic attack and they give me Xanax, right? So now I've just blasted my brain with a bunch of dopamine. And if I'm not working any kind of program to be self-aware and work through that, I'm probably going to be very restless and irritable until I either use something else that's highly rewarding or I figure it out. Dopamine exposure through family, oh, well-intentioned family. I see this a lot. Mom says, hey, you haven't smoked crack in 8 months. It's okay for you to drink a glass of champagne at your cousin's wedding. Or, oh, at least you don't have a needle in your arm. If you're just smoking pot in the basement, that's okay. And they don't, they mean well, and they just don't understand that you're keeping a wedge in the door. So, but that will lead to relapse. The other thing that leads to relapse, stress. Obviously, I feel like that's just a no-brainer. Like anybody that's ever known anybody who's relapsed you ask them what happened and they say something stressful happened. And then exposure to drug cues, people, places, and things, right? So people, places, and things because of glutamate. Okay. So really, okay. I will get to I see all your questions. I'm not ignoring you guys, but my flow will be interrupted too much. So exposure to drug cue, people, place, and things. So where does this happen, right? This happens all over the place. And this is things like, well, obviously, if you choose to engage with the same people, that you were engaging with when you were actively using, their glutamate has linked them, right? So the overwhelming urge and craving to use is going to be there. But I mean, we see this just like simply, let's say you go to the Circle K, you've been abstinent for 3 months, you go to the Circle K to buy some milk, you turn around after paying, and who's standing there? The guy with the blue hat that lives on the corner of First and Third, right? The guy where you used to cop your dope. So your brain goes, oh, that guy, that dopamine, and you get a little blast of dopamine. And then you leave, and for the next 2 weeks, you're restless and irritable and discontent, and you don't understand why. And it's because your brain was triggered by glutamate from seeing that guy. And it depends on where you are. Are you just abstaining, like white knuckling it? I'm just not using, in which case there's a good chance you're going to go out and use. If you're not going to the guy's house directly, you're going to the bar, you're going to go to the drive-through, you're going to try something less dangerous in your opinion, right? So exposure to drug cues can be very, very triggering. Okay. So how does the brain drive people with these good values, right? I know right from wrong. So how is it that I'm violating my core value? And the answer is craving. Okay. And craving is the activation of the reward center. So that is us dead in the or dying in the desert from thirst. I'm dying of thirst. Um, I can't think about anything else except getting water. That's it. That's all I care. I'm giving up my kids. I'm giving up everything just to get that water. That is what a craving is. Okay. That is not like, oh, I want chocolate or whatever. Like this is like obsessive compulsive thinking. I cannot get away from this feeling that something is wrong and I need to change the way I feel. And there's only one way my brain knows how to do it. It's going through the files. There's only one way I know how to deal with this craving, and that is to use something. So true craving is an activation of the survival mechanism of the reward center, and it happens over and over and over in someone in active addiction or early recovery. And that is the point that is the reason the choice argument fails. Because people always say, if I put a drug in front of you and I put a gun to your head and I tell you if you use that drug, I'm going to shoot you. You can choose not to use that drug. And I will say, first of all, the reward center is very capable of prioritizing level of threat. And in that moment, it would recognize that the gun is a greater threat than not getting that dopamine. Okay. So it would be able to make that priority. But what that argument doesn't account for is the fact that that person is going to be so incredibly distressed in that moment, sweats, chills, stomach, like unable to think about anything except that drug, but knowing they can't have it, right? Who would choose that? Who would choose to feel like that? Nobody. Nobody would ever choose to feel that bad. So when this craving kicks in, the midbrain is going through the files and looking for the solution to this problem, right? I feel this certain way and I need to escape it, and I'm going to go through the files. And when it finds the file that it wants to use, it's like, oh, thank God, and it holds it up. Cravings will pass usually within 10 minutes, or with the use, obviously. But after the 10 minutes, it'll pass, but it's only like a 30-second pass, and then the craving comes back. So you have about 30 seconds where the rational brain comes back online and goes, what just happened? I feel like I was chloroformed. What's going on? Like I don't know what's happening. So the frontal cortex comes back online, and it's like, oh, here's a file. Where did this come from? And it pulls up that file and it goes, oh, you know what? I'm the primary breadwinner for my family, and I can't provide for my family if I can't work, and I can't work if I can't sleep. Therefore, I need to use something to help me sleep. And I have just rationalized the use of something which will satisfy my midbrain, but also logically gave me justification. So this is where willpower comes in, okay? Because that 80% of that 20% that had problematic use of substances, but not addiction, that was able to put it down, and they say willpower, that's the solution. Here's how willpower works. It's a frontal cortex function, okay? So when I'm in a stoplight, I'm physically capable of driving through a red light. But my brain says, don't do it. You're going to cause an accident. You're going to have consequences. You're going to get a ticket. You get hurt somebody else. So willpower keeps my foot on the brake at a red light. Okay. But the second that light turns green, I have permission to go, which means all the willpower in the world is irrelevant. It becomes useless. I got a bucket full of willpower on my passenger seat that I was using to keep my foot on the brake, but I have permission to go now, so it's useless. Okay. So when I pull that file out of my brain and I say, oh, I need to use something so I can sleep, so I can work, so I can take care of my family, I essentially just gave myself a green light, and willpower became useless. I just gave myself permission to use. So even if willpower was what was keeping me from using up until that point, it's no longer going to be a useful tool, at least not by itself. And then once there's a reason and we feel justified and we have permission, we've given ourselves permission, that's when we start seeing the behaviors that we as society and family and whatever see, right? The lying, the stealing, the manipulating, the rationalizing, making excuses, etc. We see these behaviors. And it's not to say that people shouldn't have consequences for bad behavior. It's saying let's have a little bit of compassion and understanding for the fact that they have something going on in their brain that prompted them to be doing that. And then we start to see what looks like what's called neurobiological dissonance, right? So our midbrains not only seek pleasure, but they also seek relief from distress. So now we start to see this problem because persistent use means that the chemical becomes both the problem and the solution, right? So the brain goes, I like that chemical because it fixes my distress. It makes me feel better. But that chemical is also what's causing my distress. And so and it becomes this traffic jam in the brain. And this is why people with addiction will often tell you, I told myself 1,000 times I wasn't going to use today. And the next thing I know, I had a needle in my arm. I had a crack pipe in my mouth. I was sitting on the bar stool crying, not wanting to do this. But here I am doing it. And I don't know what's wrong. I don't know why. I don't understand. I really made this firm decision. And that is because of neurobiological dissonance. So what's going on in the cortex? Let's talk briefly about the cortex, okay? So the breakage part is in the midbrain. That's the downregulation of dopamine receptors. Those will come back over time with abstinence or with certain medications, but there's going to be a period of time where the person is pretty dysthymic and depressed. So what's going on in the cortex is, like I said earlier, the cortex is where we wire skills. We wire skills through the frontal cortex. So the first time I pick up a substance and I use it to solve my problem, whatever problem, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm mad, whatever, right? I'm using it to solve the problem. My brain builds a highway from feeling bad to feeling good, and it's to use substances. And the more I use a substance to fix my problem, to cope with life, to deal with whatever, the more on-ramps I start building because of glutamate. Glutamate goes, hey, when you use a substance, you get instant gratification. You're instantly fixed. Instant gratification is an on-ramp to this highway. Oh, hey, when you have a problem, if you use anything, you put something in your body, it fixes the problem. So using chemicals to fix the problem, that's an on-ramp, right? And so all of these behaviors and triggers and people, places, and things start to be on-ramps to this highway. And that becomes your solution. And the only way to stop using that highway is to hang up some police tape and close off the highway altogether and build a new one. And the only way to build a new highway is to start practicing new skills. And so ultimately people, will struggle with kind of these concepts because we get really fixated on this idea that I'm just not using addictive substances and that's going to solve the problem. And we're not paying attention to the fact that, we're keeping these on-ramps open by allowing and continuing certain behaviors. So essentially what happens is you develop this loss of control, which is violating your core value system, right? Craving, which is that overwhelming activation of the midbrain, and then persistent use despite negative consequences. If there are no negative consequences, there's no reason to stop, but it could be legal, financial, medical. There are tons of consequences. And the thing is, like, if a loved one says to you, I'm worried about all the alcohol you drink, and your first response is to be defensive, you don't understand, that's how I deal with stress, blah, blah, it's legal, whatever your excuse is, and then you continue to drink without investigating, then you've just placed the use of a substance over the care and concern of a loved one. How is that not a problem? Because if a loved one says to you, I'm worried about all the chocolate chip cookies you eat, my guess is you're going to at least go, that what, that's weird, but I'll look at my chocolate chip cookie consumption. Like you're going to at least acknowledge that someone that you care about has a concern and you want to look at it. But if you're defending immediately and you're not going to change that behavior at all, then you're basically saying this substance is more important to me than you and your concern for me. I will skip the behavioral addictions, but essentially they work the same way. They're just not cross-reactive. So if you're addicted to meth, you're addicted to heroin, whether you like it or used it or not. But the behavioral addictions are not the same. They are very genetically specific. I will basically, let's do this. Okay, so how do we treat it? Just quickly. We treat acute medical issues first. Obviously, we're going to treat overdoses, strokes, heart attacks. But then we move on to detox, which is not treatment. Detox is just getting drugs out of the system. We move on to quiet the midbrain. The only way to do that is with abstinence or medication. And then we restore the cortex. And that is the most important goal of treatment. We are trying to restore the cortex. We are trying to build a new highway of coping from A to B. With detox, essentially alcohol and benzodiazepines are the most problematic detoxes. This should be done under supervision. Benzodiazepines are your Klonopin, Ativan, Xanax, Valium, the clonazepam, the Zams and the Pams. Those are prescription meds usually used for anxiety, and chemically they are almost identical to alcohol. So taking a Xanax 1 milligram 3 times a day is equivalent to doing like a shot of tequila 3 times a day. You're going to have seizures and DTs coming off of them, potentially dying coming off of them. So they're very, very chemically similar to alcohol. Opiates, nobody dies from opiate withdrawal, but people with opiate use disorder have a very unique intolerance to discomfort. And then opiate withdrawal is the most uncomfortable thing you can go through. So you take someone with no tolerance for discomfort and you put them in the most uncomfortable situation. And chances are after 2 days of that, they won't be able to take it anymore. They go back out, they use the exact amount they were using before. Their tolerance had started to come back and now they overdose and die. So they die from withdrawal secondarily. So that's also better done under supervision. Everything else is much more dangerous during intoxication versus withdrawal. So like your stimulants, cocaine, methamphetamine, even marijuana, those are more problematic while they're actively using versus detoxing. They feel terrible detoxing, but they're not going to die from it. So the goal is essentially quiet the midbrain, build the cortex. That's it. That's all we aim to do, right? And quiet the midbrain, abstinence medication, build the cortex. Let's get some skills. And the skills typically are, obviously the cognitive skills. We have to learn how to deal with stress and regulate our emotions, and so forth, but spiritual skill sets. And I will tell you, nothing heals the brain faster than finding a purpose and spiritual growth. Nothing. And that's been shown over and over. Okay. And I'm not talking about religion. Religion and spirituality occur in 2 different parts of the brain. You can use them to connect each other, but that's a choice. Spirituality is simply your personal growth, your ability to start to become more selfless and serve others versus selfish. That's a part of the brain that's involved in spirituality. There's an emotional part of the brain in the limbic system where spirituality is, which same part of the brain where addiction happens, which is why getting spiritual growth, developing a connection with a higher power is the quickest way to start getting dopamine receptors to come back to the midbrain. Punishment doesn't work. I feel like that should be obvious. We can take away the drugs, we can get your dopamine receptors back, but if you have no skills to manage life, your first response is going to be jump back on that highway. So I can put you in a jail cell for 5 years. You never touch a drug during that time. You get out, you say, I'm never using again. I'm, whatever. And then you find out your mom died, dog died, spouse was cheating, something like that. And your first response is to use a substance. may not be the one that got you put in jail, but it'll be a substance that's highly rewarding, and ultimately it'll lead back to that substance. So for cortical change, like for building a new highway, we have to do counseling. We have to do some sort of development and practice of skills. But self-help groups, 12-step groups or church groups or smart recovery or life ring or any of those recovery frameworks, right? They all have the same sort of goal, which is to find a higher power. They don't call it that in some of the other groups because I don't know, they were cleverly disguising it, I think. But essentially, you want to find this higher power. You want to get this connection with self and something greater and find your purpose and whatever. That's the goal. But the way to get there is through other people. Having a connection to other people, having people hold the mirror up to you and say, hey, we need to really look at this behavior. Hey, you really are starting to kind of slide back into your old patterns of behavior. So the connection to other people will actually link the oxytocin bonding in the frontal cortex will start to help create those highways faster. So connecting with people is almost like recruiting extra volunteers to help build your new highway more quickly, right? That's the idea is we got to build that highway quickly. And over time with abstinence or medicine, those receptors come back, but that won't be sufficient if we do not have a highway. Recovery is not just cessation of use. It is not just a chemical problem, it is a connection problem. So it's about building a life that feels safe and meaningful and rewarding. But typically you have to abstain first. You have to allow that reward center to start recalibrating and let the neuroplasticity start the healing process. And community is a huge piece of this. And the community can do this by certainly normalizing help seeking, right? Make it normal for people to go get help for addiction just like they would go to the doctor. Helping fund, obviously, early intervention and prevention in schools, because we are not going to make this disease go away. We're not going to treat it to extinction. Our best bet is to try and prevent it. And the best way to try and prevent it is to teach the children skills that we're teaching the adults once they've already been addicted, right? Let's build them a highway now so that even if they stop using this highway, they have it to fall back on if they become addicted later on in life. And then, we're looking at recovery supportive housing and jobs and eliminating the stigma essentially is what has to happen. We have to help get rid of the stigma so that people with addiction are not seen any differently than people with like heart disease, who are capable of working and paying rent and being productive members of society. And then the antidote is belonging, right? So recovery friendly spaces. And I think a lot of places are really good at this now, creating these recovery communities, right? So places where people can go to hang out, places where gyms that are recovery friendly, art programs. And then again, sort of opening up the framework to say anybody with addiction, there's all different pathways to find what you need to find, but please do one of them so you can find that. You can find that relief from self. And obviously, it would be lovely if we could shift the cultural narrative and get rid of the glamorization of all of these drugs and the hustle culture and escape-based coping, right? Oh, you've had a stressful day, go get a drink. Here's your margarita. Well, during 2020, all I saw in my newsfeed as a woman over 40 was rosé all day. Right? Oh, you should drink wine. That solves your problem. You're a woman over 40. You should be drinking wine. Oh, your kids are driving you crazy. Drink some wine. Like that's the solution. That's really the best we got. But that's what we do. And then, promoting emotional literacy, teaching children how to deal with emotions rather than numbing or running away from or escaping. Because the only way to create a life or to create a life that you don't need substances is to create a life you don't need to escape from. People heal in ecosystems, not in isolation, because they get sick in isolation. So I'll skip that one. And I talked about that already. So with that, I will shut up and I will look through your questions. And if you have other questions, I don't have a problem with people chiming in. Let's see. Okay. Legality, yep, that's what I said. Shame is self-induced trauma. I really hope we can get, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, you can have the slides. I don't care. Stan, so there's a host of about 25 different genes. I can get you a list if you'd like that they suspect are involved or they know are involved, but it's a pretty long list. But yes,
Thank you.
I will. Well, I'm sorry, what?
You said, I said thank you.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
You know, Nicole, Dr. Labor, if you would send me the slide presentations, I can put them on our resource page and people can access them that way.
Sure. I thought we did. So I'll resend them.
Oh, we did do it. They're there. I'm sorry. Your slides are on the resource page. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. If you go to the website where you registered, there's a tab that says resources, and you click on that and you'll find the downloads for each of the speakers.
Yes.
Keaton has her hand up. She has a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Hey, Dr. Labor, it's so great to hear your presentation. Really enjoyed it. Wondered if you were, I'm a kind of a student, I'll say, of Dr. Andrew Newberg and neurotheology and that work that he's doing at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm also writing a program for incarcerated youth based on Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, finding meaning and purpose. So I wonder if you had any thought about Dr. Newberg's work or Frankl about how that might play into the brain and how that works.
I mean, not specifically, but I think that ultimately the ideas are all the same. I mean, the idea is always that the connection with meaning and purpose, you know, whether you're defining that through spirituality and, you know, your connection to that world versus more secularly, it's still the same neurological process. It's just consciously what you're telling yourself it is that gets you there. So, I mean, I think that ultimately most people that are talking about addiction or neurology and addiction are all kind of saying the same thing. And I just think that it sometimes gets interpreted by the readers or by the followers differently. But I think that it's always a semantic issue. And it's always an issue of people like just not being able to see the broader piece. Because I know like Gabor Mate, he's a wonderful psychologist, not a physician, but he's a psychologist. And I think he's not a physician. I don't think he's a psychiatrist. And he talks all about trauma. And he has said things like, no, addiction is not just a genetic thing. But that's all he said, it's not just a genetic thing. You know, he said genes are important, but they're not the only reason. And everybody has some sort of trauma, and that's really what leads to addiction. And people hear, well, he says it's not a genetic thing. So I just think that like there's a ton of experts in the field, and I think we are all, if we all sat down in a room, we would all be saying the same thing, just with different words.
Well, I'm loath to do this. I hate to cut this off because I think there's so much that we want to follow up with. But I also have to be mindful of our schedule. I want to harken back real quick to your when you were introducing yourself. I would agree that you are an all-around badass. That was an excellent presentation, and I think we've all been enriched. And so I'm hoping that we can have you back someday soon.
Sure.
Love to do a webinar with you, or people need to hear what you have to say.
Sure, happy to do it. And I also just put in the chat box my email address.
Oh, great.
So if anybody does have questions that we don't have time for right now, then feel free to just shoot me an email. I'm usually pretty responsive.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. Can we thank Dr. Labor for her presentation and so much there that I started writing questions and I so many I want to follow up with. So you might hear from me.
That's fine. I'm sorry that I left you with so many questions.
Oh, that's okay. No, there's just more I want to know. You didn't leave me with questions. You filled me with all kinds of new knowledge. So thank you.
Great. So, and again,
Yeah.
I did write the book, The Addictaholic Deconstructed, which is on Amazon. You can probably get it in your library, like, but it's basically this lecture, but like expanded. A lot more examples, a lot more thorough, a lot of my own story. So yeah, so that is available.
Oh, that would be fascinating. Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you. And for the rest of you, we'll be adjusting things a little bit. We'll be back at 1:15, where I'll talk a little bit about my experiences. But thank you, Dr. Labor, and everyone have a nice lunch break. So, Dr. Labor, I just wanted to, one question I wanted to ask real quick. There's one thing that I just can't, I can't fit into this. Oh, could you pause that? Thanks. One thing I can't fit into my understanding of all of this is that Dr. Jelinek, when he did his first work in alcoholism, his studies, I know a lot of it has been evolved since him, but he identified a gamma type of alcoholic that doesn't process alcohol differently, or does gamma type alcoholics process in their bodies different than the rest of the population. And so I'm not sure how to factor that into the rest of this addiction model. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? And you're muted, just so you know.
So, Jelinek, that's who we're talking about?
Yeah.
When we're talking about the typology of alcohol?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that.
So the acquired tolerance, right? That's what he talks about, is the acquired tolerance.
Well, I think he talks about the how the
Is-
body, for like 1 to 1.5% of the population, they process the alcohol turns to acetaldehyde, and I don't remember all the description of what happens, but for that small percentage, alcohol is handled differently in the body, and I just how it wasn't. Is that being talked about anymore in the field?
So I mean, again, if we're talking about like so the Asian population, for example, they don't process alcohol the same. So, but that's a physiological response. That's very different than what's going on in the brain. So people who have the inability to metabolize alcohol correctly in the body, they still get dopamine in their reward center from alcohol. They just have such a negative physical response, or they become addicted more quickly to escape the physical discomfort that comes with an inability to process. But really, I mean, I feel like, and again, there's a lot of different people that I read, and I don't feel like I've read Jelinek for probably 10 years, 12 years. But I felt like he was talking a lot about the typology where, like, essentially he was describing that population that gets addicted. Like that 5% that I was talking about, that 20% of the 80% of the 20%.
Right.
So I think that's what he was talking about. So there's certain people that just don't process alcohol the same way. And that has to do with the genetic piece.
Well, and I understood the way I interpreted it was that there was this one group of people that don't process it properly, and for them to stop drinking is painful. Whereas a normal drinker, if they keep drinking, they feel lousy, so they naturally stop. So he said there's that group, but then there's this other chunk of people, 20, 30 to 40% of the population that process it normally in their bodies physiologically, but he would call them, I think, maybe alcohol addicts, not necessarily. He had different typologies. So, but he said there were different typologies.
Can I jump in there a minute?
Yeah, go ahead, Barry.
I think you're right on target, and I think my opinion. By the way, Nicole, I'm an alcohol and drug counselor, and for the past 30 years. So, I think we've overused Jelinek. I think Jelinek is outdated in so many ways because what he knew and didn't know is so minimal compared to what Dr. Labor has just. That was an incredible presentation, Dr. Labor. I have heard many and listened, given many on those kind of things, and yours was just amazing. And I think I would say that we're so far past in our knowledge. We're so far past Jellinek that his stuff is, while it may be helpful, but it has its limitations, and that's
Yeah.
one of them, I think.
I think, but I really think that, like, so again, as I was talking earlier, where I call it the labor 80-20, I really think that we're talking about the same thing. So I said 80% use drugs and alcohol, and then you have 20% that develop problematic use, but only 20% of them develop true
right.
addiction, which is the ones that he was talking about, that very
Yeah.
small piece. And then that other 80% of that 20% are the problem drinkers, where they drink obsessively, they drink all the time, they drink a lot, they drink for a long time, they have consequences, but they are able at some point to say, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. That is problematic drinking. And to me,
Yeah.
that's kind of the interpretation.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I think that from what I've seen. I think the one point is made in the big book, and it's probably what Jellinek was talking about in some ways, was that they talk about alcoholics of quote unquote our type. And that's whatever that means. I think that goes back to that 20% that you're talking about, Dr. Labor. And I think that's a real important piece not to forget.
All right, you'll have to excuse me. I have to eat something so I can make it through the day.
To see patients. So I appreciate you.
Thank you so
Dr.
much.
Labor.